Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled The Forgotten Homesteaders of California. This is going to be a live online presentation with Josh Sides. He's an author and the Whitsett Professor of California History at California State University at Northridge. We're just letting in participants from the waiting room right now, and we will be getting started in a minute or so. So sit back, relax, and be patient. We'll be starting soon. Thanks. Good evening. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online presentation for Monday, August 9th, titled The Forgotten Homesteaders of California, you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We do have some more folks still joining us from the waiting room, so sit back, relax. We appreciate your patience, but we will be starting in a minute or two. Thanks. Okay, it's a few minutes past the hour. It's about 5:03, and we're going to get started. We'll let other folks join us while in progress. Good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled The Forgotten Homesteaders of California. This is a live online presentation by Josh Sides. He's an author and the Whitsett Professor of California History at California State University at Northridge. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight, we have more than 130 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do this with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much more. If you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program, as you can see on your screen, is titled The Forgotten Homesteaders of California. Again, it's a live online presentation by Josh Sides. Josh Sides is the Whitsett Professor of California History at California State University at Northridge. He is the author of Backcountry Ghosts, as well as LA City Limits, African American Los Angeles from the Great Depression to the present, and Erotic City, Sexual Revolutions and the Making of Modern San Francisco, which is the winner of the Bulla Prize and the Lewis Mumford Prize. Tonight, he's going to be talking about the Forgotten Homesteaders of California, the subject of Backcountry Ghosts. For a little background, not going to go into too much. As you may know, in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, the most ambitious and sweeping social policy in the history of the United States. In the Golden State, more than 100,000 people filed homesteading claims between 1863 and the late 1930s. More than 60,000 Californians succeeded claiming about 10 million acres. And the fascinating stories of individual homesteaders in California and the ways that they shaped the future of California and the American West is what Backcountry Ghosts, the book, is all about, and some of what you'll be hearing about tonight in this lecture. So if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat or the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Josh Sides and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Josh, it's all yours.
Kevin, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here this afternoon, and very grateful to have the Book Club of California host me for this talk. I have just finished a summer semester on Zoom, where I've been teaching for the last year and a half, as we all have, and I can say that I'm a little zoomed out, so I won't be as diligent as I usually am about responding to the questions in the chat area until the end of the conversation. But if things come up that Kevin wants to interject, that's totally fine. So don't feel neglected if I don't respond to your queries until the end. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight and to be at an event. Of course, I've just learned of the club rooms in your at your headquarters, and I'm eager to be invited to actually attend an event there. But until then, I'm happy to do this. Thank you all for your interest. This book has some things that are, well, let me start sort of at the beginning, which is that the Homestead Act occupies this very important place in American history, in that it's one of those things that everybody sort of knows a little bit about. And when the National Homestead Monument Museum in Nebraska is open, I mean, thousands of Americans attend each year to celebrate and to think about the amazing gift that the Homestead Act of 1862 was. And so it's very much shrouded in the kind of national story of optimism about the American West, and very much part of the sort of standard textbook history that you would read in high school and even in college courses. So it's a really critical part of the national story. And although there are many critics of the Homestead Act, as I'll explain in a minute. But I was sort of at an interesting point in my own career in life where I had finished this book on San Francisco, which was very important to me. I was born and raised there, and I witnessed a lot of the dynamics that I described in the book. I witnessed those as a young kid there. And this book was very much about where I am now. It started as a local question, and then it grew into a much bigger project. So part of the way I started this was, I live down here in Los Angeles and very close to Topanga Canyon, which is, used to be sort of a kind of, it had this sort of artistic community sensibility of something like Laurel Canyon. In the 60s, it was kind of a countercultural refuge. Now it's a very affluent area, but I met a woman at a cafe there, and she's about 85, and she was talking about her homestead. And I said, surely she doesn't mean an actual homestead, because there's some vagary about the title. But I started talking to her, and I went to interview her and looked up the records, and I see she was a beneficiary of a 160-acre parcel that her grandfather, a very impoverished Mexican immigrant, received in the 1890s. And she still lives on 10 acres of that parcel that was almost entirely free to her. And this seems so improbable to me in what we know to be the cutthroat real estate market of California, in particular Los Angeles. So the idea that people were getting free land, and let me just qualify the free thing. I mean, there was a nominal fee, and as we'll see, if you were truly poor, truly destitute, it was very hard to make a go of it. But nominally, these things are free. There's a filing fee, but as Kevin sort of alluded to, in 1862, Lincoln signs the Homestead Act, and this grants 160 acres to anybody who wants it. And of course, there's some asterisks here to mention. Amazingly, any woman, unmarried woman, could claim her own homestead. Any immigrant a European immigrant or Mexican immigrant could claim a homestead if they signed an affidavit that they were going to become American citizens. It was, of course, off limits to both Asians and Native Americans because they were both perceived as heathens and they were not eligible for American citizenship. But even many former slaves, in fact, became homesteaders because after the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction, they were able to access American citizenship. So the idea that in the most, one of the most expensive real estate places in the country, that you'd have people being given essentially free gifts of land, it seemed so improbable to me. And I had to study it more. And so that was the genesis. It was a very personal, immediate kind of connection. And that's sort of my other books were that way as well. There was something that struck me in the contemporary moment that seemed to warrant historical investigation. And so that's how the book came about. So that was the genesis of it. And just to get a bit more into the specifics of the Homestead Act. And so, and I won't belabor the point too much because I don't want to, I don't want to give a straight history lecture here, obviously, because we're talking about how books work and what they mean. But I will just say that it's important to understand that ever since Jefferson, and Jefferson was a great advocate that every single person should have 50 acres of free land to get them started as yeoman farmers, because he believed there was nothing more perilous to democracy than indebtedness. Jefferson was obsessed with debt, and he believed that if you were able to own your own land and you didn't have to work for someone else, this was the way to protect and preserve democracy. So he was very bullish on this idea of giving free land to every single settler. But the realities of the Revolutionary War and the extraordinary cost of the Revolutionary War meant that once public land became operationalized, that is, once after, in the late 18th century, once we began to map out and parcel out public lands in the United States, the federal government recognized the profound value that had, and they began to sell it off in large chunks to pay off the war debt and to get the economy of the new nation jump-started. It's unfortunate because I think that original model might have, sort of created more equitable circumstances. But the problem with the original way that public land was distributed in the United States was that, first of all, it was prohibitively expensive for laboring classes. You had to be already somewhat skilled or professional to be able to afford even what seems to us like the low cost of land per acre. But the real problem was because they were so desperate to get revenue, they did not limit the number of parcels one could buy. So predictably, folks with the most resources coming into this situation were able to get large swaths of land. And I think that in some ways that dream of an equitable land distribution was, people rudely awoke from that to the reality that this was going to be a pay-to-play situation where the greatest, people in the best position will get the best land. So, but it's worth noting that wasn't the original idea. Now, Lincoln, of course, was he was very committed to this idea. And there'd been a long struggle in Congress because the Southern Democrats at the time, they were really reluctant to support this plan or any plan of free land in the West, because they worried that the new settlers would compete or would rather, resist the idea of having slavery expand to the West. But the interesting thing is, so there were these multiple attempts to try to get a Homestead Act, but it wasn't until really the Civil War when all the Democratic, or most of the Democratic representatives from the South all left, right? They rebelled, and this gave the Republicans at the time, Lincoln's party, the opportunity to push through some really sweeping changes in the West. And one of those, of course, was the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. Another of which was the land grant colleges. But for our purposes, the most vital was, of course, the Homestead Act. So this act, of course, is famously remembered for the fact that it gave virtually anyone 160 acres of land for virtually free. And here we have this great quote of Lincoln saying, "I'm in favor of cutting up the wildlands into parcels so that every poor man may have a home." Now, it's very interesting because for those of us who read a lot of history or teach a lot of history, you are all aware of the fact that views change, right? There's these, evolution of ideas over time that become the basis of the historian's practice. And so I wanted to give you a sense about what the views have historically been. Up until the 1980s, I would say that historians took a very celebratory tone when thinking about the Homestead Act. And that's evident in this first quote by an eminent land historian. And I'm not naming these or not attributing them because I don't want to, I don't know, it just seems unnecessary to attack the second quote, which I will do, but hold on. So the Homestead Act breeds the spirit of the West with its optimism, its courage, its generosity, and its willingness to do hard work. And this kind of celebration of American democracy, and you all have heard of Frederick Jackson Turner, this amazing Western historian, who really said that the democratic values and spirit of our nation came specifically from people pushing into the wildlands of the West and transforming the landscape and chopping down lumber and defending their family and building homes, and that this was the genesis of a kind of democratic spirit. He was saying, in fact, it's not that democracy it comes west from the east. It's that it's created in the West. And so that was a very profound statement and a long-held view. And so the Homestead Act was long seen as a kind of exemplary moment in that process of civilizing, air quoting here, civilizing the West and in advancing democracy. Something changed in the 80s and 90s, and most of that, it can be described as what's known as the new Western history, where historians began to challenge these long-held tropes and stories about the West. And I think probably if I'm thinking, realistically about the generations, many of these historians in the 80s and 90s had grown up or sort of cut their teeth in the 60s and 70s. And I think we're generally sort of more left of center politically. And they really focused on the limitations of the Homestead Act, of which, by the way, there are many. And their criticism was entirely fair. And they pointed out a lot of ways in which the Homestead Act came up short. The government didn't grant, easy credit. 160 acres in dry farming country is not the same in watered country, and a million other legitimate points about the limitations. And however, I would say that people became, a consensus emerged too quickly in my perspective. That is, it only took a couple authoritative historians to say that it was limited for everyone to just refer to that. It became just a new refrain. And so here in a California history textbook that's up to date right now, it says the Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged the ownership of land in small units, but in California, the operation of that policy was almost entirely thwarted. And that perspective squares with what I was taught in graduate school and what I read. Everything pointed to that. But talking to that woman, going back to that woman who opens the book, and this, by the way, is her grandfather and the house that he built on that property that is now in Topanga Canyon. It made me think there's got to be something to study or to figure out, and so I did something that without sounding self-congratulatory, I don't mean to be, but there's a massive data set that the Bureau of Land Management and now the government land office held. And that data set became more robust and more available over the last 15 years or so. And now anybody who's curious can go and download what is known as this bulk data. Now, I know that at 5:20 at the end of your workday, nobody wants to hear about the term bulk data. And I recognize that is definitely not a appealing term, but just trust me, let me just explain it quickly to you. What the bulk GLO, this government land office data is it's got 7 sheets of data and about 1 million rows some of those sheets have all told, it's about 1 million rows. And the data doesn't always line up. So there's multiple, there's a 1 to 2 problem where you got, for example, one data set has a line of code and you have to figure out what that applies to. Now, for data analysts, and I'm sure that the Silicon Valley is full of people for whom this is very easy, not so for me, but I have a great friend in the geography department who helped me kind of massage and figure out what this is telling me. But the amazing thing that I discovered in this very cold, sterile just data was that you've got about 57 to 60,000 homesteaders in California who succeeded. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. And they claimed, something like 10 million, 11 million acres of California's public land, which is about 10% of the land we have in the state, which is about 101 million acres. So this is that. So right there, there was some confirming proof that I should keep doing the project, is my point, right? There, I met this woman. It was a very random sort of encounter. I talked to her, but maybe she was a one-off anomaly, and that's the only reason people said, "Oh, talk to her." But it seemed like there was more to this story, right? We've got at least 57, 60,000 people who received free land under the federal government plan in California. And I just thought, this is too interesting to let go. And so that ended up becoming the book. So in terms of thinking about how a book works and how evidence works and all that, I would say that for me, the challenge was to integrate this very sterile data, which is it's very detailed, but it's still sterile. There's no story in it, right? It's just a record of people acquiring title to land. But when you start to pull the names out, and then you start to look at their affidavits that they submitted, which are all in the Library of Congress in Washington, then you start to learn a lot about who these people are and how they lived. And part of the requirement for the Homestead Act, so to get to the basic terms of it, was that you had 5 years to prove up the land. And prove up was the term which meant to improve the land. And improving the land, the requirements of that were not onerous. You did have to build a dwelling, and you did have to devote some of it to agriculture. But the terms changed over time. But generally speaking, these were not onerous terms if you could afford farm implements and tools and seed, and if you had water and all these ifs. But if you had that stuff, it was not onerous. You could acquire land. Now, part of the reason I think that the new Western historians that I mentioned before, who had that negative view of the Homestead Act, part of the reason that they had a negative assessment of it is because of its rather minimal, in the end, impact on agriculture. That is, most of these folks are not able to farm enough to really be competitive in an agricultural market that's becoming more and more concentrated with big growers. But I think that's a narrow way to look at it. I mean, you have to understand that these are people, most of whom could never have afforded to buy a home or to buy property. And they're able to get, after 5 years of toil, clear title to 160 acres of California land that they can then pass on to their children. And so I became very interested in this story of them building equity and being able to pass on something to the next generation, which we take for granted sometimes as in modern America, or even at the time for middle class or upper class folks. But there was no chance for most laboring people to buy property at that time. The rates of property ownership were high in the South because people were rural and so they owned farms. But as the West expands, the rate of property ownership is way below 50%, maybe 30%. So I became very interested in trying to figure out, well, what does this mean to them, and how do they defend it, and how do they fight for it? And so the book has a lot of stories about that and about how they navigate all the hurdles of California life. And there are many. I mean, it's, I would say that the view that homesteading was disrupted by corruption is an entirely fair view. But I would say that the homesteaders themselves were not the agents of that corruption. Instead, you see large oil companies in particular become really invasive on homesteading claims. And without getting into the weeds too technical here, I would say that, up until around the early 1900s, there was no rule about, for example, the split estate. And to explain what I mean is that up until the early 1900s, there was no clarity about who owned the rights beneath homestead properties. So you'd have people who sacrificed everything, poor, working people who are trying to prove up their property. And the oil company in, say, Kern County, finds oil down, somewhere near the property, and they just go and claim the property and just stick a giant derrick in there. And they think they can do that legally because that period before homesteaders gained title was a vulnerable period for them, right? They didn't have the property, they didn't own it yet. And there was no clear guidance on that. Later, the federal government recognized the limitations of that and created a split estate system where you could own the land on top outright, but the resources were still owned by the federal government, which could then auction them off or sell them off if they needed to. So that's just one example of the challenges that homesteaders faced, but there were so many more. I mean, and part of what I enjoyed about writing this book was to think about the whole state, really from Lassen down to San Diego, and the different environments and ecosystems and how people navigated those to create to survive and to have something to pass on to their offspring in the ways that Jefferson envisioned, and certainly in the ways that Lincoln envisioned. Okay, so we start with this data here, and Kevin, I trust that I see little comments coming in. I can't actually see them, but I see that they pop up, and I hope that anyway, I hope you're calling those, and I hope none of them are saying stop talking, let's stop this. I assume they're not. Okay, thanks, Kevin. Okay, so to continue a bit, when you think about the Homestead Act, again, another sort of standard assumption about the Homestead Act that my research kind of challenged was that we think of it as really purely a 19th century phenomenon. And I realize that actually the graphics here aren't great, but what I want to emphasize is the following. There was, I would say, that one of the greatest, so the late 19th century, you certainly see a surge in homesteading, but one of the greatest surges occurs right after World War I. And right after World War I, which, sorry that my vision's off here, but you'll see this here. And after World War I, part of the challenge in California is that there's diminishing amounts of valuable public land, or farmable, or really arable, public land. And so many people who are getting this land, they're getting in the desert, they're getting in a rocky area, or in some area of the Sierra foothills where it's not really conducive to growing. But they don't care. They're trying to get their hands on something. So you see this big surge in the late 19th century here as California's population grows. And a little backstory there, remember, part of the problem that California had was that, or the leaders of California had, which is that after the global event of the gold rush, it was actually kind of hard to get people to come here. And the Southern Pacific, when they built the railroad and the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, there was a lot of, they saw that as a rusty streak to the sea that they were done with. It's only later they figured out, oh, we could actually make a lot of money by selling off land that we'd gotten. But my point is that there's a bit of a lag. It's hard for us to imagine today, just as the idea of free land in California is hard for us to imagine. But it's hard to imagine that there was a time where you really couldn't get enough people here. And so what ends up happening is this, with which you're all familiar, this sensational advertising campaign by the railroads in the late 19th century, and also upstart cities like Los Angeles, who tried feverishly to promote the region, to bring people in and to start buying properties. And of course, once that process really begins in earnest in the 1880s, there's a lot more people in California, and that accounts for the surge here in homesteading, because it is absolutely true, to the critics' point, that there were just scandalous gobbling up of public land by largely by the cattlemen of the Central Valley, And they took a lot of land through other acts, but they didn't get so much from the Homestead Act. The bottom line is this, is that there's a real surge in settlement in the late 19th century, and it begins to dip a bit until after World War II. And this is also interesting because think about after World War II, the cost of housing, first of all, private housing is starting to become a greater reality to the large number of middle-class workers who are now populating California. So there's more private home ownership, but keep in mind that still that's out of reach of most laboring people. And the term laboring classes was what they used in that era to describe people who were struggling. They didn't have the resources to really, they're living paycheck to paycheck. So that's one of the incentives for folks in the post-war period to begin homesteading. The other reason, which is very interesting and critical, is for health. We know, obviously, that coming out of World War I, many veterans were injured by mustard gas, a lot of respiratory problems. And so California, and particularly what's known down in Southern California as the Inland Empire, became a very desirable place to go because of the idea, which has some merit, that that it's low humidity, it's high heat, but it's dry heat, and that was purportedly better for lung function and general health. And a fair amount of that is quackery, a sort of pseudoscience of climatology that could cure everything. But that particular notion of the value of dry heat for people with respiratory problems is pretty borne out, I think, by the research at this point. So there was something to that. And then, of course, this continues, but the reality is that even though the Homestead Act is not repealed until 1976, the amount of available land begins to diminish over time. And so that's why you see it petering out here well before it's officially over. So that tells us a bit about the chronology of homesteading, when it was valuable and why it mattered to people when it did. In terms of where people homesteaded in California, and again, this is research that only this data could produce, and I'm focusing on that, although I will say that for those of you who've read the book or will read the book, I'm giving you, because of the nature of your organization, sort of how this is put together, but I do want to emphasize that the point of the book is to tell stories about these people. So this is sort of the foundation I'm sharing with you, but I assure you that the book is not a series of tables, but I wanted to at least explain the broad sweep of it to you. Here you'll see very clearly the critical nature of Southern California, Mendocino, Fresno, Tulare, Humboldt, and San Bernardino and LA. These are the big homesteading counties. And so let me just talk about that for just a minute. Keep in mind that Los Angeles, and I don't mean this as a native, I am a native San Franciscan, by the way. I was born and raised and educated there, and my mom still lives there. And so I still feel like it's home, even though I've been here in LA for 25 years now. But I will say that LA, and this is not an example of my Bay Area chauvinism, but Los Angeles was really rather pitiful as any kind of, it was not a metropolis in any way until the 1880s. And that slow scale of urban development left a lot of the backcountry, a lot of the county available for homesteaders. Now, most of that was in areas that were considered very undesirable at the time. And the best example of that is what's known down here is the Antelope Valley. And those of you who travel around are familiar with it. It's in LA County, but it's north of Santa Clarita, and it's in a pretty dry, hot valley. And so there was a great deal of homesteading there because Los Angeles hadn't grown there yet. And now, by the way, now it's the fastest growing part of the county for the last decade now, because housing is a little bit more affordable there, but not a whole lot. So that's the story in Los Angeles. San Bernardino, of course, purely by virtue of its massive size and its just the profusion of public land, made that viable and interesting for people. And so a lot of folks homesteaded San Bernardino. The same was true with Kern. Interestingly, in Humboldt and Mendocino, that was also very remote territory. And do remember that, California then and now it was never populated in any kind of even way, right? So the only folks in Humboldt and Mendocino in the post-gold rush era, who were, the only American business people, were all in the lumber and some fishing, but mostly the lumber industry. And so after they cleared out the natives in a brutal process that is best described in a book by Benjamin Madley called American Genocide, which you may know. But that process was savage. And then, of course, was a very concerted effort to kick the Chinese out of there as well. But as far as homesteaders went, all of that, part of the clear-cutting process that only began to be paused in the early 20th century meant that was what was known as stump lands. Those lands were of no, for the lumber industry, they were of no value after they cut the trees out. So you see a lot of people trying to settle on stump land in Humboldt and Mendocino, and it becomes kind of a backwoods paradise for people who want to have free, abundant land. And interestingly, as a side note, it's not unrelated, by the way, to why it becomes a countercultural haven in the late 60s and early 70s, and frankly, a destination for marijuana growing, because it's not just the environmental circumstances that were felicitous to that, it was also the culture of I don't know, sort of off the grid, backwoods folks. And a lot of that started with the idea of people owning 160 acres who would never have that opportunity prior to that. Significantly, there are no homesteads in San Francisco. There never were. San Francisco was, as it is now, the most competitive real estate market in the state. And all of that land was either engrossed in private ranchos or was quickly speculated upon by investors. And that's also true for the central part of Los Angeles. There was never a moment where Los Angeles, the city, would have had anything other than a few outlying homesteads. But at the county level, we had a lot more. In San Francisco, there were never any. And that speaks to the size, but also the immediate value of real estate there in the wake of the gold rush. That was unprecedented and that, exists to this day. Okay, so there's some data for you. I hope it's not too onerous to hear, but I wanted to give you a couple more images, and I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint and talk a bit more off the cuff about a couple key stories. One of the challenges that we had, and I say we because I got this great help from a wonderful geographer named Steve Graves at CSUN, and part of the challenge we had was matching up these antiquated descriptions of land boundaries, which we no longer use, right? We use latitude and longitude and parcels, but back then they had a township and range system that is very hard to approximate with local mapping technology, but we were able to do that. And so we had a little team that figured out how to match that data with contemporary geographical technology and locations. And so what we're able to do is to kind of highlight where we're seeing homesteads, and it's this basically a heat map of where you see them. And it's kind of interesting, and it confirms what you already saw in the table, but it's really worth noting this strong concentration in the Central Valley, in the foothills of the Sierras. And again, that land is not usually arable, nor is it as well irrigated as the Central Valley is. So it's not surprising, for example, that Fresno booms, but the people who live 10 miles up into the foothills or 15 miles, their situation is very different. Growing is a very dubious prospect there. So it is true that where people are getting land, they're not getting optimal land almost ever, and that's what we would expect, I presume. Here you see this North Coast, the North Coast dynamic I was describing in Humboldt and Mendocino, a really strong concentration of homesteading there. And then in the eastern deserts of California, and then down a lot in San Diego. And part of the explanation for the San Diego story was that San Diego was the last, Imperial Valley, Imperial County today, that was the last county created in California. And it was part of San Diego. So San Diego existed as a data category, into the late 1890s, early 1900s. And so the part of the reason that San Diego stands out is because it included the Imperial Valley. And the Imperial Valley was a surprisingly vital homestead site. And many of the first farmers there were actually homesteaders, and they're to be credited for, in some ways, starting that enormously fruitful agricultural county that stands today as one of our most vital. Here, for example, you see all around in San Diego County, now Imperial County, where people are claiming homesteads. And again, there's a longer story there about water that I talk about in the book and may be familiar to some of you. But what I want to emphasize here is that even in these remote places, people find ways to cultivate and to make use of their land in ways that ends up producing something for their families. And so that's a really important part of the story that I tell in here through a lot of very colorful characters. Mendocino, obviously very dense. I mentioned San Diego. Here's a map we put together looking at the homesteaders in the Santa Monica Mountains and near Malibu, and we juxtapose those with the addresses of celebrities, just to give you a sense about how extraordinarily valuable the land that they developed would soon become. I wouldn't presume to know where Barbra Streisand lives now. I presume that all these folks have multiple properties, but you get the idea. So again, there's this moment, and this is what I really want to emphasize here. I'm going to come back to this. So let me emphasize this, first of all. In terms of my findings, what all this research added up to was that the majority of California homesteaders were successful. And what that means is that they were able to improve their property, they were able to build on it, to grow enough to meet the standards, and to continue to pay for it up through that 5-year mark. Now, luckily, the Homestead Act was tough in the sense that it required full-time residency. You couldn't just go walk off and move somewhere else and come back. And you would have neighbors testify to this. But you were able to leave every day for work. And so many of these folks are not just working their farms, they're laborers in the city. And in the case of the woman I met up in Topanga Canyon, so her grandfather would cut up all the chaparral that existed up there in Topanga Canyon, put it on the back in a wagon on the back of a mule, and take that mule 30 miles into downtown LA to the Chinese cooks and who bought that for firewood. And then he would take that whole journey back. So there's all these stories of people, working themselves to the bone to get this property. And I want to talk about that in just a minute. It was significant in creating new farms, though I wouldn't say that the value of the agriculture was anywhere comparable to what one would hope, because the agribusiness was almost from the beginning in California a really big corporate thing. And I will say that I believe that it started the process of building equity for a group of, financial equity for laboring classes who would have had no other, way to gain that. And so those are some of the, I would say, scholarly findings. But let me pull out of that for just a minute and stop sharing this and just talk a bit more off the cuff about what the book means to me and what I think readers may gain for it. And I can also open up here the chat, although I can't look at it quite yet. Okay, so one of the things I would say is that there is just an inherent value, I think, as a historian, and I suspect you share my view as historians, as bibliophiles, as scholars and artists and printers, that there's an inherent value in telling these stories about the way people have lived and how they've tried to make it. And I think that that's what this book is about. I mean, I think in the end, my assessment of the homesteads is modest. It is somewhere between the poles, as you would expect, of the debate. But I think they did a lot more good than people recognize. And they were also fundamental, I think, for introducing agriculture to regions that did not have it. And they cut some of the first roads, and they planted some of the first crops, and they turned the wild country into something that approximated the civilized way that Americans thought of themselves. And again, I feel the need to just put that in air quotes because obviously that stands in contrast to their view of indigenous people who they viewed as savage. Although, as I've alluded, and as you know, I think the savagery was really largely perpetrated upon them. But in any event, I think these people have accomplished something valuable during their lives of toil. But I do think there's something else that came out of the Homestead Act that I think is a little bit problematic or a little bit challenging for American culture. And I can't escape the fact that even though this book only came out recently, I think some of it, when I finished the Erotic City book that Kevin kindly mentioned, I was looking around for things to do, and this was after the housing crisis of 2008, and I thought a lot about the connections between the housing crisis and homesteading, and so my concluding chapter, focuses on that. But I want to just kind of explain what I mean by that. I think that in terms of the narrative, it's interesting as a history teacher and as a writer, you're always aware of how long it takes for stories to settle and for narratives to become embedded. But I do think that the predominant narrative that I heard, and that seemed to be shared by scholars, I would say, is that, there was a highly predatory element of the finance world and of the banking world in particular that, exploited naivete and overpromised, and it was a function also, obviously, of financial deregulation and the abandonment of the old 30-year gold standard mortgage, and all those things are true, and that there's no doubt about that. But there's an element to me that I never heard enough about, and that was the culture that produced the idea. It is true that many unscrupulous people sold Americans a terrible bill of goods, right? A bogus promise, and that we know in some cases they were aware of. So that's real, and I think it's important to acknowledge it. But I will say that they told people what we wanted to hear, right? Which is that everybody can own a home in America, everybody. And so part of my challenge in the book was thinking, well, that idea was created, right? Because it's not always true. It's usually the case that somebody puts in the time with long-term investment in property in California, as with anywhere else, will reap the benefits, the financial benefits, and then in the end, it's usually prudent, but not always, right? And it's not always prudent, particularly if you're strained. And we live in a state where the population, in particular in Los Angeles County, I just read the other day that the population of LA County, homeowners and renters, more than 40% of the population here, I think the high, like 46%, are cost burdened, meaning they're paying 30% or more of their income to their mortgage or rent and their utilities. And you think about, why is that? Now, part of it is naturally blamed on the very high real estate market, but it is also true that we've taught ourselves that that's okay, and that everybody should own a home, and that's central to the American dream. And I ask my students every year, I've been teaching for 20 years, and every year I say, what is the American dream to you? And there's always different variations on it over time, as you'd expect, but the notion of owning one's property is central to that. That is success. And I'm not questioning that it is. I think it is a badge of some sort of success. But I am saying, I wonder how this notion evolved, because it's not automatic. It's not automatic that you go from a population in the 19th century, the vast majority of them could never afford to own land, into a population where virtually everyone thinks, if I could do it, I will do it. And maybe I still have a chance. And that would be success. That would be happiness. And so part of my journey toward the end of the book was to explain the evolution of that idea. And what I argue is that the Homestead Act was the first national act that put that idea in people's minds, that said anybody can do it. And of course, the reality was that 40 to 50% of people couldn't do it. and they nationally, in California, only 40%, but nationally about 50%, failed. They couldn't do it. And the reason they couldn't do it usually was either inadequate access to resources like water, or more commonly, they just couldn't afford it. And so if you go back to Lincoln's idea that every poor man should have a home, the reality was there was such a thing as being too poor to have a home, because the startup costs and all of the agricultural concern and the lumber and the work. I mean, it's a lot of money and a lot of commitment. And the more I read these stories, there are many in here which are celebratory, and the ending seems happy. But there's a lot of others where I raise the question, seems sort of ambiguous. I mean, okay, they toiled and sacrificed everything and experienced this chronic anxiety and need to defend their property. And in the end, what is it? I mean, it's a patch of desert land, and maybe you can pass on to your kids, but is it really enough value? Will it really accrue enough in time? And so I end the book in a kind of a little bit skeptical way. And I said, is this a healthy development for American culture, that the idea that everyone should own their land? And I think the Homestead Act was what first introduced us to that on a large scale. And I think it's a complicated legacy. So I'm going to leave it there, because I really am interested in getting over, if Kevin's okay with this, getting over to the questions and the comments. But I'll leave it there for now, and maybe I'll summarize at the very end of these questions.
Yeah, I'm back, Josh. Do you see me?
Kevin, good to see you again.
That was great.
Thank you.
I love that presentation. It was so interesting, because you started with the whole idea of free land back then. Forget about it now, but that whole idea is mind-boggling to us.
It is
now,
yeah.
and back then. And as you said, everyone knows a little bit about the Homestead Act.
Right.
I thought, oh, I know about the Homestead Act, but now I realize I don't really know anything about the Homestead Act, and I need to read this book, because
just for you, yeah.
And I was terrified this was going to be a horrible history lesson, but it wasn't. It was such an interesting history lesson, and inspiring to make me want to learn more about this whole thing. And there's some great questions. I'm going to get to them in a minute. But I do love the fact that you kind of wrapped it up there at the end, because in the beginning you talked about the California dream, or the American dream, to own land regardless of background or station. And then you kind of came back to it at the end, like the Homestead Act was like the first inspiration to setting that whole kind of culture, right? That whole idea for us.
Yes.
And that might be a little messed up, right? Because people couldn't afford it. It's a lot of work, a lot of commitment, an interesting experiment, I think, but anyway, a challenge, right? To wrap your head around. So we got some great questions. Some of them are a little specific, but
I will answer whichever one you tell me to answer.
So there is a question about kind of just the mechanics of how it happens. So people applied, and what was the criteria for applying? What did you?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I intentionally didn't go because I didn't want to do what I now know was your terrible fear of a history lesson. Okay, but all one had to do was to identify a claim, or identify an available parcel of public land. And that was done by consulting maps at the local land office, of which there were a dozen in California, as there were in all the Western states. And once you identified that, you only had to fill out, an oath that either you were, they took it on faith that if you said you were an American, you're American. Mm-hmm. Or if you're obviously an immigrant, you would sign an affidavit that said that you'd be willing to do that you would become one eventually. And that was it. And all you had to do was prove it. I mean, the term, again, and I haven't looked it closely, and I think maybe, Gray Brechen's here. Gray, I've signed your book so many times. It's nice to see you here. I can't read your question quite yet, but I would say Margot had a question about, I'm sorry, I'm not finding what I thought was there, but in any event, But that's really all you had to do. You just had to prove that you could do it, and then you had to actually go do it. Now part of the process involved actually going out and part of the problem was that the counties had not always surveyed all the land. So there were instances where you had to pay for a surveyor, and that would make things more expensive, obviously. But generally, it's as easy as it sounds, and that's what's so amazing about it. With the limitations, what I was referencing was that Margot says not everyone could own their home, not African Americans or Chinese. So as I said at the beginning, Asians and Native Americans were excluded from the Homestead Act, not by the terms of the act, by the way. There was no clause that said neither African Americans nor Chinese. It's simply by virtue of the fact they were not eligible for that. Indians and the Chinese were not eligible for citizenship.
Right.
But after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, African Americans were, and so they were eligible, and they did homestead. And there's a few who make the last chapter of this book who become, in some ways, kind of interesting, like tourists. I mean, it's a very cringy, I would say, relationship that white people have with them. They go to visit these Negroes on the mountain, and it's sort of a novelty for them. But it is true. Plenty of African Americans owned here, and a significant number of Latinos, Mexicans own land here as well as a fair number of women.
Yeah, that part was interesting when you said women early on. I was like,
Yeah.
how did that? That's pretty cool that we're included in that. So what happened kind of at the other end? You got your homestead, you had to improve it, right? 5 years later, did someone come back and check up on you and see if it's been improved? And like, what was that process? And did people lose their homesteads that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the problem, it's a little bit quaint. It's hard for us to imagine, but really the neighbors would fill out affidavits that said, yes, this guy's been here the whole time. Now, there's the modern cynic will recognize that there's plenty of opportunity for fraud there because they have a mutual interest in protecting themselves. But actually, and there's no, I have not done a systematic study of this, but all of the ones that I read were actually affidavits written by private landowners rather than public landowners. And so, I don't know, I took them seriously, and, and there's other ways to cross-reference that too. If you really want to do a systematic thing on what happened to the property over time, that would be a much bigger lifelong endeavor, which I don't want to do. But it was basically word of, it was a man's word or a woman's word is her bond of honor, and that was about it. And but there was plenty of people that knew what was happening in the area. So
what's the calculation? Like 40 acres and a mule people hear about, and this is 160 acres.
Yeah.
There was a question that someone texted me, like, because you keep mentioning the agriculture, and their question was, well, were they homesteading to farm for themselves, or were they really homesteading so they could build a business and be a commercial?
The experiences run the gamut. I mean, we do know that, so there are plenty of stories of people whose sole occupation is farming, and they sell, and the way they make money is selling off a little bit of extra, products at the local market. But it runs the gamut. I think my sense is that most people went into this, they weren't excited to be farmers. They wanted to be landowners because it was already known that the potential value of California land, people knew about it already. I mean, even though it wasn't as spectacular as it is now, but it really depends. Like in Mendocino, people were just making shakes for roofs off of the old redwood. So most homesteaders there, their entire living was just chopping wood all day and making shakes for housing. So it really varied. The folks in the desert, they seem to, I mean, obviously they have very little chance of growing. So unless they find an aquifer or something, or, sink a well. And if they're not farming, they're just skating by with some other ranching, small scale ranching, sheep raising, anything they can to meet the standards of the Homestead Act. But I will say, again, I've thought about every objection to homesteading, and many of them, or every critique, and they're all very fair. But I will say, if you study the annual circulars put out by the Government Land Office, they change the requirements, but they're not onerous by any standard that we would recognize. They want these people to succeed.
So tell us a little bit about your process in putting the book together. So, we're book lovers here. You created a book, you have a story, like what was your research like? Clearly you built tables and maps, which I love.
They only occupy a small portion of the book. I want to be clear. No, it's a really good question. I mean, I went through this is not a long book. It is not my final book. It is not, I feel good about it, but it's tricky because you've got, essentially you've got this historiographical issue, which is, okay, I need to figure out how what I'm saying addresses the themes that historians have already discussed.
Mhm.
So how does what I'm finding compare? Well, that's something to think about. But in the end, I was just so taken with the stories of the people that you cobble together from the data and then from the Library of Congress or from, National Archives out in Paris, California, or up in the Bay Area. And then any relatives you can track down, newspaper accounts. And so I tried to make this book, and I think I succeeded. I feel good about it, is that to make it say something big about homesteading, but also to keep the eyes focused on the narrow personal drama of people just trying to survive under these circumstances.
Mhm.
And so I think I've hit that, but I don't think it resolves it by any stretch of imagination all that one can say about homesteading. I guess I hope that it serves as a kind of invitation to scholars to say, wow, maybe there is more to this. Maybe we can look at this in our areas and see what there is. And already from the small, I will say, I have not read these closely, but I can already see that there are, and this is very typical and wonderful, that there are a lot of people that know a great deal of detail about a particular homestead or about a particular area. And so my hope is this book gives those folks a framework to make sense of their own family stories,
Yeah, can you even have some oral history involved in your research? You talked about, and that's pretty cool. There,
I have to let in the cat. This is the problem.
go ahead. I'm going to put up in the chat for everybody who might be interested in
Gotta let the cat in.
I'm going to put that in the chat there now. There's a link in there to buy Backcountry Ghosts, local bookstore or Amazon. There's a link. I'll also be sending that out in the email that goes to everyone tomorrow, along with Josh's website, so you can find out about his other books.
Yeah.
We're at the top of the hour, and I am going to share all of these chat and Q&A questions with you afterwards, Josh, and there might be a couple you can get back to me about, so I can get back to some members about. But everybody loves controversy, right, and scandal. So someone texted me to ask about what's the biggest scandal that kind of happened in the Homesteading Act. And clearly there's the land baron issue where people acquired other people's land and properties and the mineral rights stuff.
Yes.
So maybe you can end here today with some exciting, scandalous story.
I was not expecting that. And I'm going to provide that for you. And I really, I don't like reading publicly because we can all read it, particularly your.
Okay.
Nonetheless, I'm just going to read you the paragraph from this chapter that answers your question. Okay. So
okay, great. That's great.
This is chapter 4. It's about Kern County. George Osmond followed all the rules in a county where nobody else seemed to give a damn. During a warm October day in 1910, he marched into the land office at Visalia and filed on a 43-acre homestead near the Kern County town of Taft. The small size of his plot was uncommon. The land was moving fast in Kern. Oil was booming, and Osmond wanted his own farm before it was too late. To support the upkeep of his small farm and the cabin he built, he worked as a prospector in the foothills east of Taft, where more than a few prospectors had made thousands of dollars from gold, borax, and gypsum strikes in the county. And so Osmond toiled both on the farm and beyond, as most homesteaders did. But when he returned home from work with his family one afternoon in 1911, he found that his labor had been in vain. More specifically, he found that his cabin had disappeared. And this goes into a story of the oil companies removing people's houses to invalidate their claim. And he ends up, the second character mentioned in this sequence, ends up blowing up with dynamite a derrick owned by none other than Doheny of the Doheny oil fortune. And the court does not look favorably on his dynamiting. There's also another wonderful, terrible story about a man whose wife is nearly killed by poison. There's a shocking amount of people poisoning one another in the 19th century over land things. And so there's a bit of that skullduggery in the book for sure.
Nice.
So
People will enjoy that.
can enjoy it. And would you now, Kevin, I don't want to disrupt your perfect flow. Do you want me to address any of the questions on the side right now?
If you want to take a quick look to see if there's anything in there, there's a bunch in there. Some are specific. There's definitely some great job. This was fascinating kind of comments.
Good.
In there, which I totally echo those. There's comments about who was excluded from participating, which you've talked about.
Yeah. I think if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to respond to Grace Brechen's point.
Sure.
Is that okay? And
Yeah.
I'll on that, and I don't need to minimize any of the others because these are all very good. But I've never met Gray, and I've been assigning his book for a long time now, so I feel like at least is to answer his question. So Gray, my sense of your question, and again, if not everyone's on it, says, could you explain how great land baronies like the Kern County Land Company were assembled from 160-acre homesteads to the benefit of those knob pillars like Tevis and Hagen? And what I would say, Gray, is that so the unscrupulous, skullduggery of Tevis and Hagen and Miller and Lux and all these people, yeah, it is known, and I fully respect that is how that played out. However, what I would say is that scholars have tended to be a little bit broad in how they define homesteads. That then contributes to the misapprehension, I think, that Miller and Lux and these guys got rich off of homesteads. It was not the case because they had another way to steal land, which was usually through the Swamplands Act or the Desert Lands Act. So there were other public lands acts that were very easily exploited because they did not contain what the Homestead Act contained, which distinguishes it from all the other land acts of that era, which is the residency clause. You had to be on there for 5 years, and you had to be a resident, and that was very hard to fake that. Both Tevis and Hagen and Miller and Lux and these others, the bulk of the public land that they got was from things like Swamplands Act, which required and they did do dummy filings. We know that. Dummy filings meaning, as Gray knows, that the companies basically paid off people to sign as individual grant recipients, paid them off, and then conglomerated all themselves. But that was very rarely the case with the Homestead Act itself. It was with these other non-residents requiring grants like the Swamplands Act. And to end on one of the most famous stories, which Grace certainly knows, and it may be apocryphal, I don't know, but it's such a good story that I just decided I always will say it may be apocryphal, but there is, of course, to Gray's point, the fabulous story of the Swamplands Act, where that all one needed to do to prove the reclaimability of this public land was to prove that there was, in fact, water on it. And in the Central Valley, that was often very challenging. And so there's a wonderful story of, I think it was Miller or Lux or Tevis and Hagen or all of them, famously strapping a rowboat on the top of a wagon so that they could claim that they'd come across the valley in a boat to demonstrate that that land was actually wet and needed to be reclaimed for agriculture. Who knows if it's true, but it's been repeated so often that it's too good not to tell.
It's lore now, yeah.
Thank you for these questions and for caring and for your interest and participation. Kevin, thank you for your wonderful moderating. You're so wonderful at this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you were so fascinating. I have 3 pages of questions that you saw the chat and the Q&A questions. So it really helps when the topic is good and the presentation is dynamic. So this was super interesting to me. I would love to hear more about bulk data, to be honest.
You're the only one I've ever heard say that, Kevin.
And I was a little sad to hear that the book is not a series of tables. So
thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I hope to see you all in the club room, one of the club rooms someday.
Yeah.
We're not on, Zoom and cat duty.
Yeah, Josh, this was great. Thank you again for joining us. We definitely want you to come join us in person at some point, maybe in San Francisco, or when we restart our in-person programs in Southern California. We'd
Please,
love to have you back and do that. So thank you.
Thank you all.
And thanks everyone for attending this Book Club of California program tonight. Please join us for our next online program. It's titled Aztec Codices, an introduction to their form and contents. And that's going to be a week from tonight on Monday, August 16th from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. It's going to be a live online presentation by Lori Bornasian DL. She's the professor of art history at Texas Christian University. And you can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or by using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the Book Club of California. So again, thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone. Hope you all have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Good night.
Bye, Kevin.